Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches Jekyll and Hyde. In this video, I'm going to be taking you through the big theme of duality. We'll start with a definition of what duality is and how it applies to the novella, and then I'm going to take you through some key scenes and have a big old conflab about Jekyll and Hyde and the duality of man. So let's get started. Okay, let's start by just talking about what duality is, because this is a word that sometimes throws people. So the actual definition is the quality or state of having different or opposing elements within one kind of being. So just imagine one person, two opposing characteristics within it. So in terms of Jekyll and Hyde, it's quite straightforward because Jekyll and Hyde is saying, let's look at the duality within mankind. And obviously it's got its big focus is the fact that all mankind has the capacity for good and evil within them. Now, duality doesn't have to just be good and evil. It can be opposing characteristics in different ways, but chiefly the concern in this novella is that of good and evil. Now, there's a really small example of duality that happens within the first couple of sentences of the book. And it's really small and it's really subtle, but I think it's worth commenting on. And that is because it's on the first page. It's literally within the first couple of sentences. In fact, it is the first sentence. It says, Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of rugged countenance that was never lighted by a smile, cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse, backward in sentiment, lean, long, dusty, dreary, and yet somehow lovable. Within the first couple of sentences, or within the first sentence, Stevenson is saying, hey, check out this man. He's got opposing characteristics. Yes, he's kind of dull. You know, this, I've underlined this quote here at this bit here because that's perfect for your flashcards. Long, lean, dusty and dreary. He's old, he's dull, he's boring, he's miserable. You know, it's almost slightly metaphorical, you know, the idea of him being dusty, sort of old, like he's hidden in a back room. But he is lovable. Okay, so quite a contrast, massive juxtaposition. So we've got early signs of duality. Page 1 is literally saying this is what the story is about. It's about opposing aspects of characters. Another place that duality is hinted to is in the setting. Now, you can talk, for example, about like the setting of London in itself, like the fact that there is such a divide in London, that London houses both the richest and the poorest, that London, particularly Victorian London, houses this idea of, you know, etiquette and respectability, and then there's this seedy underbelly as well. So definitely the city of London can be seen as a symbol of duality. But what I'm interested in is the actual buildings themselves. I've done a whole PowerPoint on setting and symbolism, so do have a look at that because you might find that useful. But this is the description of the back of Jekyll's house, okay? Not to be confused with Hyde's house. It's simply the door that Hyde uses. So always be careful when you're describing the door and the back of the house. So this is just a little bit. And again, I've just underlined a few bits that are quite useful for flashcards. If you go to that part of the book, there are other bits as well, you know, sinister block, thrust forward its gable. There are other things you can use, but it showed no window and it was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, so secretive, dark, mysterious. And then we've got marks of prolonged and sordid negligence, blistered and disdained. So these metaphors here all suggesting total lack of care. It looks run down. It's really not very pleasant. And there's something kind of like dirty. That's like sordid. It's sort of like corrupted about it. So this door that Hyde uses is massively representative of his personality. Fine. How is this to do with duality? Now remember that the door, this little back entrance, is going into Jekyll's house. Now at the front of Jekyll's house, you have a door which is worn with a great air of wealth and comfort. Okay, so complete juxtaposition to this blistered and disdained. Wealth and comfort, blistered and disdained. And then he goes on to describe the inside of the front of the house: large, low-roofed, comfortable hall, a bright open fire, costly cabinets of oak. Utterson was wont to speak of it as the pleasantest room in London. The house houses both of these aspects: blistered and disdained at the back, warm, open and bright at the front. The house is a symbol for Jekyll's identity, and the two opposing descriptions is a representation of duality. Yeah, it's not just this bit is Jekyll, this bit is Hyde. It's actually the house is Jekyll, and Jekyll holds both of these aspects. Now, there's a really clever place that you can take this to. If you look at what Enfield and Utterson are chatting about the square, I think it's Enfield, remarks, the buildings are so packed together about that court that it's hard to say where one ends and another begins. I.e., let's say that the house is a symbol for Jekyll, with the front of the house being his good parts and the back of the house being his bad parts, and therefore also Hyde. If it's difficult to see where one begins and one ends, you could argue that that's saying, well, to what degree is the house full of goodness and to what degree is the house full of darkness? So there's the kind of shift. How much good, how much bad? Where does it begin? Where does it end? Oh, isn't Stevenson clever? Okay, so we've done the subtle in Utterson. We've done the lovely symbolism in the setting. Now we need to talk about Jekyll. If you get an essay on duality, the majority of your essay should be focused on Jekyll, his motivations, what he thinks about duality, because he talks about it openly. So let's start with his reflection of himself as a young man. This is right at the beginning of chapter 10, Jekyll's full statement of the case. He says, "Indeed, the worst of my faults was a certain impatient gaiety of disposition. And he found it hard to reconcile with my imperious desire to carry my head high and wear a more than commonly grave countenance before the public." Look at that, duality. So he's got this kind of like, he calls it impatient gaiety of disposition. That's very euphemistic. He means the bit of him that wanted to go out, drink loads, I don't know, maybe have a bit of opium, maybe have sex with a prostitute. Naughtiness. That's probably the stuff that Hyde gets up to. But unfortunately, he can't cope with that because he's got this public persona, which is all about being really grave and really serious and, you know, abiding by the kind of rules. So he's already, as a young man, seeing this difference in himself. And because of that, when he reflects, you know, when I reach years of reflection, so as an adult, like looking back on that and thinking about his sort of explorations into science, he stood already committed to a profound duplicity of life. That is such a big quote for duality. Duplicity really means sort of being a bit sort of two-faced, but like two-sided. So again, he's pointing out that his life has these two opposing sides, duality. And then I've underlined this bit as well, because I really like this bit. "Though so profound a double dealer, I was in no sense a hypocrite. Both sides of me were in dead earnest. I was no more myself when I laid aside restraint and plunged in shame, than when I laboured in the eye of day at the furtherance of knowledge or the relief of sorrow and suffering." So the point he's making there is that duality doesn't mean pretending to be something that you're not. He's not saying that duality is when you're bad but you pretend to be good. No, he's saying really truly, as a person, you can be both good and really mean it. So, you know, when he was, you know, scientific pursuits, or when he was being really philanthropic and looking after people, that was real and that was true. But so was the other side when he plunges into shame. When he starts being naughty. He's saying it's not about being hypocritical. He really is these two sides. And that's what brings him to experiment in this way, okay? And so what ends up happening is this realization that the two parts of him, the two manifestations of, you know, of him are very much good and evil. And you can see this in the way that Jekyll and Hyde are described, particularly like next to each other. So he states, "Even as good shone upon the countenance of the one, Jekyll, evil was written broadly and plainly on the face of the other." So we've got this idea of absolute opposition, Okay, note the way that this is really focused around appearance. That's because the Victorians believed in this concept called moral physiognomy, which was that the way you looked sort of represented your moral compass, you know, like who you were inside. Absolute nonsense, of course. But yeah, so Jekyll, good, Hyde, evil. It's sweeping, but that's the general gist. In that lovely metaphor, evil was written broadly. He also points out when he's describing why Hyde creates these sort of like strange misgivings in people, why people shudder around him, is because all human beings are commingled out of good and evil. Yeah, duality. That's everyone, with the exception of Hyde, because Hyde is pure evil. It's like if you think Jekyll contains these two. Jekyll contains these two sides, but Hyde is like one side extracted, and that's why people sort of ooh whenever they see him. And this is, I suppose, sort of the point. In this experiment is actually a failure. At the beginning, he didn't see it as a failure because he was really enjoying, you know, being Hyde. But the point is that his intentions weren't pure when he went into it. Look at this lovely juxtaposition in this, you know, really, really nice personification. Again, with duality, it's perfect here. My virtue slumbered, so virtue meaning goodness, slumbered is sleeping. My evil was kept awake by ambition. Okay, so you've got that juxtaposition between virtue and evil, and then sleeping and being awake. And it's by ambition. And so what he is saying is that when he did this experiment, it was the darker side of him that was kind of pushing it, because it was an arrogance. It was about playing God. And so because of that, what was created was his darker side. Yeah. If he had gone into the experiment thinking, I'm going to do this amazing thing for mankind. I don't want any glory. I just want to help the world. I want to banish evil and bring forth goodness. Then he would have brought forward an angel rather than a fiend. So that's another quote. But unfortunately, all he is left with is evil, wholly evil Hyde. So this, and then himself, Jekyll, who struggles because of the duality of his nature. So he's basically created pure evil and then kept his own flawed self that is still commingled out of good and evil. He hasn't managed to distill and separate, and therefore the movement was thus wholly towards the worth. If you get a question on science, or the significance of science, the fact that his experiment was actually a failure is really important here. Now, I mentioned when we were talking about setting about this idea of like fluidity, like how much of you was the good and how much of you was the bad if we're considering duality. And that's important here because there is definitely a shift with Jekyll and Hyde. So when he's describing the early presentations of Hyde, like when he's describing how Hyde was at the beginning, he reasons it with, because 9/10 of his life had been of effort, virtue and control. So he's saying that in the balance, as Jekyll, the parts of him that are good are like 9/10, and only 1/10 of him is evil. Yeah, so in terms of duality, mostly good, little bit evil, which means that when Edward Hyde appears, he's smaller, slighter and younger because he's not been exercised. You know, as in the bad parts of Jekyll haven't been exercised. So Hyde is small. Okay, so majority good, tiny bit bad. Until he starts taking the potion again and again and again and again and again. Because then what he's doing is he is exercising and nourishing Hyde. So all of his life, he's not been exercising his naughty parts. Sounds so wrong, sorry. And then as soon as he starts taking the potion, he does. Yeah, he starts doing bad things all the time. And when he's not Hyde, when he's Jekyll, he's thinking about it, isn't he? He's reliving it. He's enjoying it. He's going back into his memories. So even as Jekyll, he's exercising those darker parts, which is why It seemed to him as late as though the body of Edward Hyde had grown in stature, so the evil side getting more powerful. And then, excuse me, the last thing that I wanted to mention about this shifting proportions of good and evil, I think is really represented in the way that in Jekyll's narrative, he starts confusing narrative voices. So he's writing as Jekyll, so of course, first person. But when he's describing what Hyde is getting up to, you would assume he would still use he. But when he describes how he gnashed his teeth upon him with a gust of devilish fury, so this brilliant zoomorphic metaphor and metaphor here that suggests power. This is describing Hyde when he's in a panic before he gets Lanyon to come and help him and he attacks his cab driver. But he uses first person pronoun I. He uses the I as in Jekyll, so you can see this sort of blur, but is it Jekyll, is it Hyde? And then later on in that passage, he actually addresses it and suddenly shifts back to using the third person pronoun he. He, I say, I cannot say I, because he's horrified. So at this moment, he then goes, no, I don't want to be a part of this, distance. And so then he shifts back into third person, describing Hyde's actions. Then you get this amazing metaphor. That child of hell had nothing human. Such irony in this metaphor, because obviously children are associated with innocence. Hell, not so much. So massively opposing ideas, this juxtaposition. You could almost argue that that's an oxymoron. What's even more ironic about it is that if Hyde is a child, who's his father? Jekyll, that child of hell, whose dad is Jekyll. So again, this notion of like the true depths of Jekyll's darkness perhaps being pointed to in this lovely metaphor. So that takes you through pretty much everything you need for an essay on duality, and you'll notice it's much more kind of focused on Jekyll and Hyde towards the end. The first two are like almost like your lead-ins, and if you were running out, like if you were worried about time, I might even bin the Utterson one and just do setting and then straight into Jekyll and Hyde. But there are some other useful quotations that you might like to look at, you might like to write about, which I'll just pop up here for you. So this is such a kind of powerful one. He says, I've been doomed to such a dreadful shipwreck that man is not truly one, but truly two. So, I mean, that in itself is just summing up duality in a nutshell, isn't it? That the essence of man is not one, it's two. And then that understanding has doomed him to a dreadful shipwreck. So it's a great metaphor that basically says pushing too far and considering duality too far has been the end of his life. Another one that just sums up his experimentation. It was on the moral side and in my own person that I learned to recognise the thorough and primitive duality of man. There it is, in quote form. And again, he's saying it's my experiences as Jekyll that have helped me understand that man is not truly one, but truly two. And this is one of my favourites. I know it's a big old chunk of quote there, but I have underlined some bits. You know, I was talking before about how his intentions weren't pure, and that is why he created a devil, a fiend rather than an angel. This is a further discussion of those intentions, which I think is really telling. This would be really good if you've got a question on Jekyll as well to talk about in terms of what he's like. So he says, if each, I told myself, could be but housed in separate identities, life would be relieved of all that was unbearable. So if you could separate your good side and your dark side and kind of push them away from each other, life would be better. And he says, the unjust might go his way, delivered from the aspirations and remorse of his more upright twin. Look at that personification. So he's saying your dark side could go off and not have to worry about being kind of shamed and told off by his good side. And the just could walk steadfastly and securely on his upward path, doing the good things in which he found pleasure, no longer exposed to disgrace and penitence by the hands of this extraneous evil. So he's basically saying, separate them out. The good could go off and do good things. Hurrah! And not have to worry about any dark parts getting in the way. Fine, lovely. But actually, he wants the bad part to go off and have fun without being limited by any sense of moral reasoning or shame. So right from word go, he is not trying to separate them to create more good in the world. He's trying to separate the two parts of him so that there is a bit of him that can go and do whatever the heck he wants without any comeuppance. And that's why Hyde is produced. That's it from me. Sorry, video went on a little bit longer than I'd intended, but oh, duality, it's such a big theme. Hopefully that makes sense. Some really complex ideas in there, so please do get in touch if you've got any questions or comments, or if you want any help with other quotes. Just drop me a line in the comments and I will get back to you.